We're going to be talking about the salt of the earth. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. This is Jesus' words. Remember, Jesus sat on a mountain, went up to a high mountain, and opened his mouth and started speaking. He says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." So that's our text today, okay? I've listened to a lot of sermons on the salt of the earth, and there's a very wide range of what's said about these verses. How many of you have heard the concept of this is just about the seasoning, like a table salt, right? It's just about seasoning, okay? How many of you guys have heard of this being taken sort of another step, and they say it's about preservation? Have you heard that one? Okay. I remember hearing that for the first time and hearing somebody talk about how you are a preserving factor in this world and how in that day, if you wanted meat, you didn't have refrigerators. So they would pack it in salt and make sure that it could be eaten a couple days from now, you know. So they talked about that, and I just thought, man, that's really interesting. That's very much from their culture, and so I thought that must be true. But then I always come back to this verse, and Jesus doesn't say that. He doesn't say that salt is a preserving factor. He doesn't say you're about preserving. Now, I do believe that the church is meant to preserve something good in this world. So, don't take me wrong. But if you look at the actual passage, Jesus says this, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor." Okay, so I feel that we should look at what he says and just stick to that, right? He doesn't say if the salt loses its ability to preserve. He says if the salt has lost its flavor. And this actually is to me, sort of a more lighthearted understanding of the passage. And maybe it's more simple, but I'm okay with that. If Jesus was delivering a simple message, then that's what it is, right? So he says, "You are the salt of the earth, and if the salt has lost its flavor," I have the King James in my head, "wherewith shall it be salted," right? How is it going to be salted, right? How do you salt, right? Now, this word here for flavor is morino. That's the word in Greek. And the word means dull. Like it's the flavor has become dull, right? So he's saying, what if the salt has become dull? What's interesting, I was taking a look at this, and it turns out that this word translates a Hebrew word, right? It's spoken here in Greek, but it probably comes from a Hebrew word where it actually refers to becoming dull of heart. So I think that Jesus is word playing here. Like, don't become dull of heart. And he actually confronts several times in Jeremiah. I think it's in 10 and 50, something, I think those two chapters, maybe 51. But he says, you are becoming dull of heart. And so I think that Jesus is picking up that theme. And he's sort of using salt as a kind of a way into it. But he's using this phrase to say, hey, you shouldn't become dull in your heart. And people who become dull in their heart, in those passages, it has to do with following after other gods, letting our love for him soften, and then instead going a different direction. And it turns out that those who love God less really have less reason to love other people, right? So you become dull not only toward God, but toward people. And that's a problem. We need to remain salty, so to speak. We need to remain sharp. This verse, this word here for that term, lost its flavor or has become dull, that shows up in two other verses. I'm just going to read these. Luke 14:34, Jesus says, "Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned?" And then Mark 9:50, again, same thing. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Okay, so he says this. He doesn't at any point say the whole preservation thing. He just sticks to this idea of if you're losing your flavor, then it's not good. You need to be salted. You need to stay salty, right? You need to be flavorful toward others. But there's another passage that really threw me for a loop. And I want to park on this because once you can see it, I think the verse becomes really lively. It becomes more useful, okay? So I want to take a look with you guys at Mark chapter 9, okay? By the way, you see I've got some brightly colored stuff here. This is from Eden. Eden made these for me for Father's Day. So these are Father's Day things. Ooh. Okay, so take a look at Mark chapter 9. And I want you to see what he says here. Many of you may not even remember these verses, okay? I know that when I looked at these again, like, how have I missed this? I've read these verses before and I don't remember this, okay? So this is how Jesus leads into the same words from a different passage, okay? So he says, everyone will be seasoned with fire. Oh, what does that mean? Everyone will be seasoned with fire. Every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. But if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Okay, what does that mean? Okay, anybody got any ideas? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so I honestly didn't. I looked at it, I was like, if this is what Jesus really means, because he's kind of packed more ideas around it, I wanted to know what this means. So I went to some of my favorite commentators. They're real simple, basic guys. Their names are Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. I've mentioned them before. And they just said, it's a very difficult verse. One of the guys says, it's a very difficult verse on which much has been written, some of it to little purpose. Right? People get confused by this. Commentators get confused by this. He says, everyone probably means every follower of mine. Just in the context of the flow of Mark chapter 9, he's saying every one of you, every follower of mine, will be seasoned with fire. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so they go on. It says, and the fire with which we must be salted probably means a fiery trial. Now think about that in the context of what we've just read. Okay, in Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus is talking about the Beatitudes, how he will be blessing people, it ends with a lot of conversation about being under persecution. So this now starts to make sense, right? He's saying you guys are going to be persecuted. And blessed are those who are making peace in persecution, right? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Or is it I think that's the one. You shall be called sons of God, right? So he's talking about persecution. So if he says everyone will be seasoned with fire, what he's saying is every one of you, my followers, will undergo a fiery trial, okay? And so I love this because what he's talking about, and let me just read this again. Everyone will be seasoned with fire. Every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Okay, so let's look at that one. What does that mean? Every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Okay, so in that same context, he says every one of you will be seasoned with fire. What do you do with a sacrifice? You burn it, right? If you go back to the Old Testament, you'll find out that every sacrifice was seasoned with salt. Every sacrifice of the Old Testament was seasoned with salt. And I did the research. We could go through it, but I did the research. The grain offerings, they were told, put salt in that. The meat offerings, they were told, put salt in that. So what does that little salt mean? What does that mean to put salt on the sacrifice? And Jesus is going to give us the answer to that, but I just want to stop here and just recognize that Jesus is saying, you will be like a sacrifice, okay? You guys remember Romans 12:1? I know some of you could quote it. I know Jim could quote it right now. He says, I beseech you. That's like, I beg you. This is Paul speaking. I beg you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. It's a reasonable act of worship. Okay, so he's saying God has done so much for us. He's just laid out, the book of Romans, the previous 11 chapters is God's plan for salvation. And how much it's like a minimum, right? What he's saying, it's a reasonable thing to offer yourself as a sacrifice back to God. And it's a living sacrifice. It's not a dying sacrifice. It's a living sacrifice. Peter talks about how we will undergo trials. And those trials are meant for purifying us, but we're living sacrifices. So in other words, it's not about dying. God is not saying, I want you to die. What he's saying is, I want you to live for me. And that life, that living sacrifice is our new approach to God, okay? But what does that mean to be seasoned with salt, okay? You're the sacrifice now. You're going to undergo fire. But what does it mean to have the salt, okay? Let's look back at Mark chapter 9, verse 50, and I just want you to see the second half of that verse. So Jesus himself explains this one. He says, have salt in yourselves. Have salt in yourselves. Then he says, have peace with one another. Okay, now I want you to put this all together. Okay, my life is now to be made as an offering to God. But that offering should be acceptable, right? It needs to be a pleasing offering. How do I become a pleasing offering to God? How do I season the offering? Have peace with each other. You see what he's doing here? Jesus is doing something very interesting. He's saying you can't love me without loving people. You can't be an offering to me without seasoning the sacrifice with peace with each other. And so if you're not at peace with each other, it's going to be an unseasoned, flavorless sacrifice. It will not be pleasing and acceptable to me. Okay, so I want to park on that for just a second. There are times where we get into little arguments, we human beings and church members even, we get into little arguments, we'll get into little spats, little disagreements with other people, and it's very easy to go, you know what, that thing that they said stung a little bit. I'm going to sting back, right? I'm going to get him back. And that will be just, because eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, right? That's how we do it. They offended me, I'm going to kick back. What does Jesus say? He says, no. No more eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. You may think that's just, and maybe in some technical sense it is. It is just to take somebody else's eye if they've taken your eye. But he says, I'm calling you to a higher standard than justice. Right? Jesus wipes away all the old plan, right? Because he dies for us. He becomes the justice. And so now we're to offer mercy because their sins against us have been paid for. So would it be just to require the payment for their sins again and take their eye, right? So he changes everything by becoming the primary sacrifice. 1 John 4:21 says this. Let's actually look at this one together. 1 John 4:21. This is the commandment that we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. He who loves God must love his brother also. This is very much like Jesus saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind, might, depending on the passage that you're reading. He says, but you shall love your brother as yourself. And then he says later, you shall love your enemy, right? Look at the verse right before this. This is the one that sounds like Tom to me, okay? 1 John 4:20. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar, right? Call your bluff. You're out here worshiping, and then you leave the worship service, and somebody grabs that donut before you grab it. What are you doing? You know? And we're not seasoning our language with salt. I don't think that really happened, but we're not seasoning our language with salt. We need to be seasoning our language with peace. That's what Jesus is calling for. And think about the gravity of this. If he's saying your living sacrifice life, your living sacrifice is unacceptable to me without the salt of human peace. It tells you how important this is to him. It is not going to be acceptable to me. This just reminds me a little bit of those passages where he says, if you have brought an offering to the altar and you have aught against a brother, right, something between you, forget the sacrifice, go back over there and take care of what's going on with you and your brother. Then when you come back, your sacrifice will be seasoned with peace, right? So go take care of that stuff. I bet you everyone in here, everyone in this room, if I were to say, there's another believer who's offended you, every one of you could think of somebody. Every one of you in your brain just had a face show up. Have you seasoned your conversation with salt? Have you left the sacrifice and gone and made peace? We're a body of believers, and we will spend eternity with each other. Amen? Got to get along, right? If someone says, I love God, and he hates his brother, you know he's fibbing. He's a liar, okay? Paul picks this up as well. And I love, this is actually like the language from Jesus. Colossians 4:6, he says, let your speech always be with peace, seasoned with salt. Notice that, with peace, seasoned with salt. So he's kind of drawing off of this idea that your life is a sacrifice as well, right? You're going to offer it to God, but if you're not seasoned with peace, the sacrifice is no good. It's not acceptable. It's not pleasing. How many of you guys love steak? Okay? Got enough guys and girls in that one, okay? How many of you guys like steak without salt? It's just different, isn't it? It's just different. Aaron and I have been eating a lot of meat lately. We've been going for this meat thing. And I have to do salt. In fact, we have started to use hot sauce. Thank you, Craig. We started to use hot sauce because it becomes boring to taste the same thing over and over again, okay? So you need some kind of seasoning in it. And it's funny because like I've always loved steak. I've always loved red meat. But I've gotten to the point where it's like if I'm eating red meat and don't have some kind of flavor in it, it's like, it becomes like this gristle that you're chewing and there's no flavor. Well, we don't want to offer that kind of sacrifice to God. We don't want to be a flavorless sacrifice. We want to be seasoned with peace. So here's my question. How does this little message that Jesus is doing, how does this fit into the big kingdom message, right? Remember, when it says in Matthew I think it's in actually chapter 4, it says that he comes out and he starts to preach the gospel. And as we looked at this, we found that term gospel comes from Isaiah. It means good news or glad tidings, okay? And it comes from these older passages where it's a pronouncement that the kingdom is coming, right? And so Jesus is pronouncing, it says, the gospel of the kingdom. So for us, we take that and we kind of go, oh, well, yeah, it's, just church. That's what it means, And that's really what it does mean, but I think that we need to sort of layer and deepen our understanding of what church means, right? It's not this like the good people's club, where we go and we get to talk about how bad the rest of the world is and, or whatever, That's not what it is. You guys are the kingdom of God having come to Foresthill, right? The kingdom has spread all the way from Israel all the way into the Americas and has spread into the Foresthill. And you guys are the kingdom in Foresthill, okay? So you are part of that gospel kingdom, okay? So it's the good news that God's kingdom is coming. So Jesus shows up and he starts preaching the arrival of the kingdom. He's the king. And he's saying, my kingdom is here, and I'm here to help those people who are, what do we say, drained, grieving, and what was the other one? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the persecuted. Yeah. So it's like, blessed are you if you've been treated poorly, right? So the kingdom is here, and the king is going to undo all the injustice, right? That's what the gospel of the kingdom means. He has shown up, and he's talking to Israel. And Israel is a group of people that have been waiting for a king to show back up for 600 years. Literally from the time of Daniel. Oh, the kingdom's back. Jesus is the king. What are we going to expect? What's that kingdom going to look like? So there's a couple of psalms called the Songs of Ascent or the Psalms of Ascent. And this is what they would sing every single year, actually a couple times a year, when every Israelite was required to come to certain festivals. And they would come in and they would celebrate in Jerusalem, okay? And every year, this is what they would do. They would sing Psalms 120 through 134. About 15 Psalms, is that right? Yeah. They would sing these Psalms on their way up to the temple. I would love to be there for this. How many of you guys have ever been to Africa? Couple? Yeah, that's right. You guys have been there. Have you heard them singing? They have like cultural songs. I've heard that they'll sing. So I knew a guy that went to Africa some time ago. I don't know if they still do this, but they said that in Africa, one person will start singing and people across the street will start singing the same song. They don't know each other. They'll just start singing. And they all know the same songs. And this is kind of what it would be like. Like but in this case, hundreds of thousands of people all chanting the same songs, right? And these are the songs they would sing in expectation of the kingdom every single year, okay? Let me give you examples and see if you can just catch the common theme, okay? This is from Psalm 120, the first of those songs of ascents. They would ascend to the mountain. Psalm 120, verse 6. My soul has dwelt too long with those who hate peace. I am for peace. Psalm 122, 6. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces. Psalm 125, verse 5. Peace be upon Israel. Psalm 128, verse 6. Peace be upon Israel. Psalm 133, 1. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell in unity. When they went to their kingdom every year, expecting the kingdom to come back, they were hoping for peace. They wanted peace. That means a couple things. Not only a lack of war, but unity in the kingdom. They wanted unity in the kingdom. How good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell in unity. Another part of this whole scenario, too, is when they came up that mountain, they knew that if the Messiah were to be there this year, if the Messiah were there, then he would glorify Israel, like Israel would suddenly become great again, as if it were David's kingdom again. And then when that happens, all nations would flow into Israel. The word that's there is the word something like river, so people would river to Israel. But the river is like going upstream up the mountain. It's this kind of cool picture, poetic. But you have all nations coming back, and that's why peace is so necessary. Because when all the nations come back to their Messiah, then they need to have peace, or there's just going to be a chaos. It's going to be war and fighting, So the kingdom really needs to be filled with peace. Very important part of this. So they expected a kingdom of peace. Okay? So here's Jesus. He's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and he's saying, while you're following me, you're going to undergo some persecution. Every sacrifice will be seasoned with fire, but every sacrifice needs to be seasoned with salt. Every sacrifice needs to be at peace. So I'm not going to accept, how do I say this? The sacrifice is unacceptable until there's seasoning in the sacrifice. And that seasoning is how you treat each other, okay? Now listen to this. This is the next words. This goes back into Tom's message last week. But I want you to have this kingdom mentality on your mind, okay? He says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. The question is, in the Hebrew mind, what was the city on the hill? Jerusalem, okay? We don't have this mentality because we don't go to Jerusalem every year. But this is most likely what would have been on their minds. We got the king talking about his kingdom, and he's saying, you are a city on a hill. When people went to Jerusalem, when they would go sing their songs of ascents, there are people, historians, that would talk about this. They said things like, there is nothing more glorious than Jerusalem. And these are like non-believers, Romans. They said, there's nothing more glorious than Jerusalem when you're walking up these mountains and you get to Jerusalem, and that temple, which was faced with gold, would hit the morning sunlight and it would just explode with light. And so these historians said that it was hard to look at. It was so bright, okay? So that's during the day. Another thing that they would do is at night they had several, in some cases they say it's 2, in some cases they say it's 4, but they had 75-foot menorahs. That's, by the way, a candle on a lampstand, okay? So they had these 75-foot menorahs, but they weren't like menorahs like the ones you'll see in church where there's like a candle flame on it. We're talking about torch menorahs, And so they said that these torch menorahs would light up the countryside around them. So if you were traveling to Israel at night, and we can miss so much of the experience of this just by not imagining what it's like. Remember, they're doing sacrifices, and a lot of those sacrifices were offered back into either the temple service or back to the people so that they would take as families. So you have this massive, fragrant barbecue happening. And I don't know about you, but I love the smell of barbecues. I love that smell. So they're coming up, and there's like this holy barbecue happening in Jerusalem, and it's lit. The mountainsides are lit by these 75-foot menorahs, and the city on the hill cannot be hidden, right? It can't be hid because it's lit up by torches, In that ancient world, when they talked about light, they used light as a metaphor quite often, and different cultures use it in different ways, okay? So if you were a Roman, what did you mean when you said that you have been enlightened or that there's glory or light, things like that? If you were a Roman, what you were talking about was power, okay? To Rome, light or glory means power. The glory of Rome means the power of Rome, okay? In Greece, light means enlightenment, and it still does kind of in America. It's kind of how we think of it. But in Israel, light means righteousness. Light meant righteousness, okay? Let your light so shine before men that they glorify your Father in heaven, right? Light meant righteousness. So as a great example of this, in Psalm 37, verse 6, he actually says this straight out. He says, he shall bring forth your righteousness as light. So you get that direct correlation there. He shall bring forth your righteousness as light and your justice as the noonday. By the way, if you want to take a look at this, look at Psalm 37. We just read verse 6. Now, take a look at verse 11. It's translated in mine as the meek shall inherit the earth. That's one of the Beatitudes. This is in Psalm 37, okay? But notice, again, I want to read that. The humble shall inherit the land, right? And shall delight themselves in the abundance of what? Peace. Think Jesus is drawing from something here? Okay? So he's saying, I want you guys to be at peace. I want to bring peace into this land. But notice he says, God will bring forth your righteousness as the noonday. Is it our righteousness or is it his? Okay, so let's go back to the menorah. You guys know that, you remember the picture? We went through this whole thing some time ago. But the menorah is designed to look like an almond tree. And that word for almond in the Old Testament was the same word as awake. So it's the awakened tree or the awakening tree. That's what they called it, okay? That's how it would have sounded in English if they were speaking English. They built this menorah like the awakening tree, and the reason they did that was because every year the almond was the first thing to bloom in Israel, and it would bloom white. And so if you were walking through Israel during the blooming of the almonds, you would have these trees filled with light, right? Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches, right? Very similar pictures, okay? So he will bring forth our righteousness, or I could more likely say his righteousness in us, right? So you got this menorah that's supposed to look like an almond tree, and what kind of fruit does this little almond tree bear? Light, right? The menorah was supposed to bear the fruit of light. You go back to Acts chapter 2, and when the new church becomes the people of God, what happens to them? There's tongues of fire that are placed over them, right? They have now become the new menorah. They've now become the new group, the people of God. And they're now bearing his light, right? It's the same picture over and over and over again. It is always going to be God's light. It's always going to be his righteousness. And it's not enough for us to think, I'm going to try to muster up some of my own. What he's saying is, no, come to me, root yourself into me, or splice the branch into the vine, and let me bear the fruit. Okay? So what does that require of us? Prayer, right? Connecting with God. Lord, I need your help. I need your righteousness. But he's the source. That's why it says, they will see your good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven, right? Because when you're bearing out his righteousness, all that people can see is what a righteous God they must have. Especially if we have approached this by faith, and if we've said to people, I'm living by faith. When they see our good works, they should be able to go, oh, that's amazing that thing just happened, whatever it is. What a God they serve. What an amazing thing that God has done using that vessel. So I want to take these two metaphors and just sort of put them together, okay? You've got the salt, you've got the light. The salt is specifically related to the sacrifice. But the light was specifically related to the kingdom, okay? I think that these are two metaphors that communicate the same need for righteousness. They both communicate a need for righteousness, but in slightly different contexts, okay? When Jesus talked about the salt, it was in the context of persecution. When he talks about the light, it's in the context of coming back to the kingdom. So you could say one is in a negative context, the other one is in a positive context, okay? One is in the context of difficulty, the other one is in the context of success and hope, okay? It's like Jesus is saying, I want you to be people of peace now. Because one day I'm going to build my kingdom, and I want it to be a kingdom of peace. And if you're not willing to be at peace under persecution, how will I build the successful and hopeful kingdom of peace in the future? I need you to be people of peace, even when you're under persecution. Actually, that is specifically the test, especially when you're under persecution. Another way to put this would be, one day, sacrifices will be done away with. In the meantime, let the living sacrifices be seasoned with peacefulness. So we know that one day the sacrifices really will be taken away. But right now, the trials that happen today are our way of being sacrifices to God, a living sacrifice. So make sure that we're seasoned with peacefulness. And by the way, since right now it's a kingdom of darkness, right now we can be lights here. But one day God will build this kingdom of light, and it's like, I want you to be people of the light now while it's dark. Listen to Matthew 5:17. He says, notice the focus on righteousness in this passage, okay? These are the next verses in Matthew. Do not think that I have come to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Let me just clarify this real quick. When Jesus is talking about law, he's talking about a covenant that he has with this group of people. Okay? So in other words, what he's saying is, you guys are still under this covenant with me. I've got to deal with you, and I'm not going to scrap it. Okay? He says, heaven and earth will not pass away. Let me go to the next verse. Verse 19. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven. This is something, we're going to get into this as we go next week and beyond, but Jesus was talking about the people who had it right. Like, I want you to imagine somebody in your mind who you think that person figured it out. Like, they're doing really great in their Christian walk. Imagine Jesus walking up and saying, you need to be better than that guy, right? What does that mean? How do you get better than that guy? This is how they would have been thinking. How can we outdo the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? What Jesus is going to be revealing as we go here is that the scribes and Pharisees knew the system of laws, but were not loving with the system, right? They had a form of righteousness, but had denied the power thereof. They were not living with that kind of love and that kind of righteousness, which by the way, in Romans says that love fulfills the law, right? So if you're loving, you're taking care of the law. These people were focused on the law and had never gotten to that point of loving. So fulfilling neither thing. This is how our lives can also exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. If we have rooted ourselves into the tree and have allowed Jesus to fill our lives with righteousness and bear light and fruit out into this world. So the question I have is this. Is your conversation seasoned with grace? Is your conversation seasoned with grace? I'm going to say this. I'm going to take a risk on this. I have no idea of the storyline, and the people involved won't tell me. And so maybe that's better. But I do know that Judah walked out last week. Maybe it was the week before, 2 weeks ago. And he found a woman crying. And I was very proud of him because he got in there and he just helped her feel better and stuff like that. But it come to find out that somebody had said something to her that was really offensive. And she went away and let it out. And it breaks my heart to know that happens. And I think it breaks God's heart to know that happens. Yes, there are things to stand on your feet and say, I know the truth, right? There are times to do that. And in fact, we should always be doing that. But when God calls us to have our conversations seasoned with peace or seasoned with salt, what he's saying is, make sure that you do that, stand on your feet, and go for what's right. But when you do that, season your conversation with peace. Be kind when you do it. In fact, in Colossians, you can take a look at this. You can look at the reference at another point. Colossians 4:6. Look at the context of that. What he's saying is, in your conversations with those on the outside of what? On the outside of agreement with you, right? If you don't agree with them, if you're talking to somebody who is not in agreement with you, have your conversations seasoned with peacefulness. So in other words, when you're talking to somebody, you might see that moment as a moment where you can defend your faith, stand on your feet, become a living sacrifice to God, right? In that moment, you're sort of risking your popularity with the person you disagree with, and you're standing for truth. And yet God goes, that's not enough. What I'm looking for is for your conversation with that person you disagree with to be seasoned with kindness, seasoned with peacefulness. And so when we stand up for what is right, make sure you're doing it in a kind way. We don't throw bricks, if you know what I'm talking about. Okay? This week has been an interesting week. That's not our job, right? We don't throw bricks. We don't cuss out people at Capitol buildings and things like that. What we do is we want to make sure that we are like light in the world, right? And if we are bringing darkness into the world, then, well, Jesus talks about this later. He says, how great is that darkness, right? How great is that darkness? If your eye is filled with darkness, the darkness is immense. So we need to be light. We need to be peaceful.